While South Carolina started the Civil War over the issue of slavery and they talked about states' rights, what they didn't talk about was democracy. A minority of Americans, the wealthy planter elites, are really the ones that were determined to leave the Union. 75% of the Southern population did not own slaves. They were involved in the slave system. They may have aspired to own slaves. They benefited from that slave system. But it was the planter elites that decided to leave the Union. If you look at the secession convention, say in South Carolina, over 80% of the people that voted for secession were plantation owners. In some areas of the South where they held secession conventions, areas with few slaves tended to be pro-unionist. It's the reason we get West Virginia when Virginia decides to secede after Fort Sumter. The people in West Virginia were not secessionists. Anyways, the fear was that the federal government would force Southerners to give up their slaves. And this is what leads to the secession conventions. And it's why we say a minority of Americans caused the secession itself. President Lincoln did not pledge to ban slaves altogether at first. There were some efforts at a compromise, which he largely ignored. What he promised was to preserve the Union in democracy. While South Carolina argued that the states had signed the Constitution and the states had the right to leave, Lincoln said that no, the first three words are "we the people," not "we the states," and therefore the Union cannot be separated legally by a state vote. And this is what leads to the war. After a few months, Confederates in April fired on Fort Sumter as it was trying to be resupplied by Lincoln and his military. This is really the trigger event that starts the war. It leads to Lincoln calling for volunteers. Once Lincoln calls for volunteers after Fort Sumter, then the upper southern states that secede begin to secede, places like Virginia. And the Civil War has begun.